right about now. The Funk Soul Brother. Check it out now.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Right About Now podcast. I'm Jonathan Small, your host. This is a show that takes a deep dive into the origin stories and tips and tricks of successful writers. Plus, we just like to hear a good epic tale. And what better epic tale than that of Game of Thrones? My guest today is James Hibberd. He's an editor-at-large at Entertainment Weekly, and he is also the author of a brand new book about Game of Thrones called Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon. Now, James interviewed 50 people for this book, including cast members, producers, executives, and the crew, to capture the behind-the-scenes stories and classic moments from this show. The show might have aired its last episode last year, but it's still very much on people's minds, and I think 2020 probably would have been a little bit better with a little Game of Thrones in it. I miss that show so much. So you would think that with so much written about Game of Thrones over the years, there really wouldn't be anything new to reveal. But actually there is. And James, in his oral history of the book, definitely stumbled across a few gems. So even if you're not a Game of Thrones fan, I think you will find this conversation very illuminating and interesting. James reveals a few surprising things. You'll want to hear the story about Bruce Willis's yacht or the grooming requests of Peter Dinklage. There's a bit about prosthetics in awkward places. And I talked to James about how he wrote the book and how he got his interview subjects to open up to him. And just in general, what it was like to be on the set of Game of Thrones, you know, in those last years when security was at a max. There was checkpoints, there was people putting tape over your cell phone cameras. James, working for Entertainment Weekly, got to go to a bunch of the sets in Spain, in Morocco, in Ireland. So he had some firsthand experiences watching that show get made. So as Tyrion Lannister once said to Jon Snow, "Never forget who you are. Never forget what you are. The rest of the world will not. Wear it like armor and it can never be used to hurt you." Damn. So James Hibberd, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
This is such a great book, really interesting book. Maybe miss Game of Thrones. I think the world really needs Game of Thrones this year in 2020. Unfortunately, we need a distraction. So this was a nice to kind of go back and relive a lot of my memories of that show. And I'm just curious, how did you get on that beat for Entertainment Weekly, the Game of Thrones beat? Because you were covering Game of Thrones when it was just an idea, right?
Right.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was part hard work and part luck. I mean, I broke the news of the pilot when I was at Hollywood Reporter in 2008 and briefly talked to the showrunners about what they were doing. And the way they described the show, I was like, man, that actually sounds like something I might like. So I went and picked up a copy of George R. R. Martin's first book, and I was reading it. I'm going, oh my God, this story is incredible. And there is no way that they can make this into a TV show.
No, why was that?
So I was like, you know, I mean, the books have like thousands of characters. You know, they have these massive battles. They kill off the main character, you know, near the end of the first book. And I mean, it just seemed just absolutely unmakeable on any sort of television budget. So my thought was, well, you know, if they actually pull this off, this is going to be a massive hit and change television. And if they don't pull it off, it's going to be like this extremely expensive train wreck. As a reporter covering television, either way, that's a story, right? So I started covering it pretty intensely early on and started going. That's after I moved to Entertainment Weekly, which, you know, fortunately, you know, sends reporters to movie and TV sets, which is a great thing that they do. And beyond that, you know, as the production got more and more secretive and had fewer and fewer, you know, people in the media being allowed to know things, I think one reason why I was able to keep going back was that from the very beginning, I wasn't interested in spoilers, and everybody else was. I personally don't like spoilers. I don't like to know what's going to happen. I like to be surprised. So I don't put that in my coverage. I'm very interested in the creative process, but I'm not interested in spoiling it for other people. And the producers are very like-minded in that respect. And I think that's one reason why I sort of got an inside track.
So right away, they knew that you were going to be a guy to be trusted, because that was really a big fear always of Game of Thrones, right? The spoilers. As the show became like a worldwide hit, that became even more of an issue. But even early on, people were nervous about the spoiler thing and you kind of revealing too many secrets.
Yeah, and it's weird because early on, it's tough to remember this now, but most of the big spoilers were all out there. You could Google what happens in the first season of Game of Thrones and learn that Ned Stark, gets decapitated in that season. Yet at the same time, most people didn't do that. Most people don't like to go around like screwing up their viewing experience. And so if they weren't fans of the books, that reveal, along with many of the others like the Red Wedding, still completely had the effect that the showrunners had hoped. It completely shocked and stunned and just enthralled audiences. So even when the spoilers are out there, a show can still like manage to surprise.
So, I worked at TV Guide for a little while, and I would get assigned shows, and I always, like, you got Game of Thrones, I got John from Cincinnati. It seems there's no justice in the world. No, but nobody knew that Game of Thrones was going to be a big hit. I mean, that was, in fact.
No.
So talk to me about that. David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, who are the showrunners of the show, you have in your book that they sort of had this infamous meeting with George R.R. Martin, who obviously wrote the series. And I didn't realize it was at the Palm Restaurant, a place I've been. First of all, tell me the obstacle here. Like, George R.R. Martin felt like you. He felt like there's no way this could ever be a television show, right? So what were they up against when they met him? They knew they wanted to do the show. They loved it. But they had no television writing experience, these two. Or they had very little television writing experience. They've never ran a show. They're young kids at this point. I mean, young in their career.
Yeah. They were both around 35. They and they had some movie writing experience, and they had both written novels, but not TV experience. And what was going in their favor is that George R.R. Martin had received all these different proposals to adapt his books, his saga, A Song of Ice and Fire. And producers constantly wanted to do it as a movie. It's like, well, we'll do one movie and then see if it will work. And it's like, well, what if it doesn't work? Then you end up with like this one bad movie. Or we're going to do it, but we're going to cut out like half the characters. And it's like, well, I don't want you to cut out half the characters. It's funny now because looking back, there's this, especially with people who didn't like the final season, which I'm sure we'll get to, there's this knock on Dan, David, the showrunners, that, well, they didn't have any, TV experience going into it. Well, the fact that they didn't have any TV experience is what led to the show being made, because people with TV experience would not have made the show. Nobody wanted to try and take this on because it seemed impossible to make. George R.R. Martin was a former TV writer. He had worked on a couple TV shows. He left that industry because he was so frustrated by all the budgetary and content restrictions. So he really poured the entirety of his imagination into writing these books to create something that was unfilmable, that was impossible, and that was only really possible to experience in the reader's imagination. So it was made not to be filmed. The only potential way to make it would potentially be to make it for a network like HBO. That's a premium network and has had a history of spending $100 million on projects, and could also throw in all the sex and violence and really do it as a long form story. So that was David and Dan's pitch. And George recognized that, well, this is still a huge uphill battle, but if there's a way to do it, that's the right way to do it. Fortunately, David and Dan didn't know what they were getting into.
Yeah.
and so then they had to kind of do something that nobody with real TV experience would have ever attempted to do, because they would know how impossible the task was ahead of them.
It was better that they didn't actually know what they were getting into. It's kind of like, if they could look into the future, a year into the future, they would have been terrified at what they were about to embark on. And I guess George recognized that, maybe these young, inexperienced people didn't know what they didn't know. So that could actually be a good thing. So they went in there saying, like, we're going to pitch this to HBO. Did they even have HBO's blessing to do that? I mean, they weren't working for HBO at the time.
No. They knew that they were going to have to shop it around. They took it to DirecTV, which at the time was looking to get into original content. They took it to Showtime, which was actually interested. Showtime was interested in doing Game of Thrones, but they also knew that Showtime, which was, is owned by CBS, that there was no way that they were ever going to spend the money that would be needed on it. They knew that they really only had one buyer.
And so they told George that,
that could potentially do it, and that would be HBO. So they would have to get in there.
Yeah. So going into that meeting with George, they knew that would be appealing to him. I guess they assumed that might be appealing to him, the HBO angle. They also, they were huge fans of the book, so that was real. I bet, a lot of people couldn't even really penetrate the books, right? Because they're impenetrable to some people who don't like fantasy writing. But also, there's a famous question that he asked, George asked them.
Right. Yeah. At the end of the lunch, which ended up being, several hours, George famously threw a curveball question at them. He suddenly asked them, who is Jon Snow's mother? Now, if you're reading the books, that's a big mystery in the books at that time. And, and actually I think still hasn't been revealed in the book. So, there's lots of fan theories, but they had no way of knowing. As it just so happens, the night before the meeting, they had talked about that and sort of came up with their own theory that it was Ned Stark's sister, Lyanna Stark, and they blurted out their guess, and it just so happened to be right, and that convinced George, okay, these people have not only read the books, but they actually have really thought about them and they understand them. They're not just sort of passing them off as passing themselves off as casual fans.
Right. So they get George R.R. Martin's blessing. Then they go around pitching, as you mentioned. HBO is interested, amazingly, even though they had this flop, like you said, with Rome, which was like $100 million production that only lasted one season. So they had done big shows that didn't actually make it. But there's a change in leadership at HBO, and the question is, whether it's going to still go. You have a great anecdote in there that I hadn't read about, and this is all like places that are near where I live. So I was like, oh, the Equinox in West Hollywood. But where Michael Lombardo, who is the head of, I don't know his title at HBO, but like the head of programming at HBO or whatever, he gets the pitch, but he's thinking about whether he wants to do Game of Thrones. And then you said he sees one of the writers in the gym.
Yeah, Michael Lombardo was, along with, the head of the entertainment division at the time, Richard Plepler, we're trying to decide whether to take this gamble on greenlighting this pilot. And Michael goes to the gym, the Equinox, and as it just so happens, one of the showrunners, Dan Weiss, also goes to the same gym, and he spotted Dan on one of the stationary bicycles, and Dan has in front of him a copy of the first book, and he's like rereading it, and there's all these like yellow highlights in the book, and he's seeing this guy, this guy who had pitched him the show, and he's rereading the book again, and there's all these highlights in it, and it's this dog-eared copy, and he's like, these people are clearly really into this material. They're clearly really invested in it. Let's figure out a way to make this work.
Yeah. I feel like the lesson there for writers is show up with a dog-eared
the same gym as the executives at HBO.
Yeah, with a dog-eared copy of your script. But that was great that it showed him the sort of devotion that those guys had. They weren't playing around. They really believed in the project, and that's so obvious. The casting is interesting. You reveal a lot of sort of interesting inside notes about the casting. One thing that made me kind of laugh out loud was how they got Peter Dinklage. Peter Dinklage didn't really want to do it at first, right?
I mean, he definitely had some reluctance because he was coming off Prince Caspian, which was a fantasy movie from Disney, from the C.S. Lewis novels, and he played like kind of the stereotypical fantasy dwarf in that, with the long beard and everything else. And he was just like, okay, let's do something different after that. The last thing he wanted to do was get typecast, and so he was initially reluctant, and then he heard the pitch from Dan David, and he realized that what they were doing was something unique.
Look at me and tell me what you see.
Is this a trick?
What you see is a dwarf. If I had been born a peasant, they might have left me out in the woods to die. Alas, I was born a Lannister of Casterly Rock. Things are expected of me.
Normally, in these sort of shows, it's about the heroes, and whereas in George R. R. Martin's book, he's very much about the outcasts and the kids and everything else. So it was a very different perspective on fantasy, and it was going to be done in a very adult, contemporary, and potentially groundbreaking way. So he signed on.
But he had a condition.
Yeah, no beard, and because he was just like, I don't want to have the fancy dwarf, Gimli and Lord of the Rings sort of dwarf beard, and the character in the books has a beard, so that's why Tyrion's clean shaven at first. After the character was established, he does end up growing this kind of cool like rock star beard, in that he ends up wearing for the rest of the show.
So he said no beard. So the first few seasons he doesn't have a beard for that reason. He just didn't want to be sort of like stereotype, like he said. So
yeah.
The casting, they find all these unknown actors. I mean, Cersei, Lena Headey was actually suggested by Peter Dinklage. But you said the toughest role to fill was Arya Stark. And tell me how Maisie Williams was able to land that role.
Well, that was such a tough one, and George R. R. Martin, while he wasn't involved in some of the later seasons of the show, he was very intensely involved in the beginning, especially the casting. He would watch like video after video of these auditions and give notes, and he recalls in the book the moment that happened because he had seen all these kids playing Arya, and Arya is such an important character, and he was just like, most of the kids were just basically reading the lines. They're just basically memorizing and reciting. There was this percentage of kids that clearly had some acting training, so they were like told by some acting coach to be emotional. So they were like, as George put it, they were emoting all over the place. They're like rolling their eyes and over dramatizing everything. And he was just like, we're doomed. We can't find somebody, because here's the thing. They not only had to find one kid, they had to find a whole family of kids,
right?
And plus other kids too that are going to be major characters as the show goes on, and they had to also kind of look and feel like a family, and they also had to be able to handle really adult R-rated material, and they had to make a commitment that would last for years. So just finding one child actor, when you're starting from scratch to do that is so tough, and they had to find so many, and clearly hit such a home run. And then he stumbled on to Maisie's video, and she didn't look like he had envisioned, but the soul of the character was there, and she just popped off the screen, and he was just like, holy hell, I can't believe it, we actually found her.
Have you seen any of these videos? Are they like public?
Yeah, some of them are online actually. So some of the audition videos are on YouTube. Yeah.
So like she just apparently just did that in between like classes at school or something like that. Like Maisie was very.
Yeah. She actually did one interview where she mentioned that her class had a field trip that day to a pig farm, and she was very bummed out that her mom made her like do the audition, because she was like, I wanted to go to the pig farm. I wanted to do this audition. I wanted to be off with my friends. And then of course, it ends up being the most amazing thing that could possibly happen to a young actor.
So they make the pilot in Belfast, Ireland. And you say it was basically a disaster. Like the first pilot of Game of Thrones was thrown in probably the most expensive pilot ever. One of the most expensive pilots ever filmed is in the dustpan. Nobody will ever see that work. Tell me what went wrong.
It's funny because people oftentimes, when an adaption's done correctly, people kind of assume it was inevitable, that what's on screen just kind of manifested from the book. But there are endless number of decisions that have to be made. I mean, literally the haircut of a character can be like off-putting and weird and distracting and ruin all the scenes the person is in. A costume can look too new, and it's like the costume designer is really proud of it because it looks great, but it's like, wait, this shouldn't look this good because this character is up in the north and it's kind of muddy and dirty, so there's all these decisions that need to be made just perfectly. And here you had this production that, you had people you had two showrunners who never had worked on a TV show before, and you had a cast and crew who had never worked on anything like this particular show before. So, there were some actors that didn't work out. There was lots of dialogue that didn't work out. One of the challenges in adapting this is you have hundreds, if not thousands of years of history that George R. R. Martin has laid out that all happened before the events in the pilot begin. And in a book, it's a lot easier to communicate that history and fill that in to explain things. Yeah. When you're in a drama, that's very difficult to do unless you have literally characters giving like really clunky exposition or putting text rolling up on the screen or flashbacks. They originally tried flashbacks in the original pilot. So you want to convey, you want people to not be lost in the story, but you also have to make it feel realistic. And that's a very tricky needle to thread. So
HBO sees the pilot and they just didn't like it, right? It just didn't work.
Yeah.
Too many clothes. They said it kind of looked like almost like an upstairs, downstairs, like two like parlor, like close shots and not like sprawling, this giantness of that show is one of the sort of appealing things about it.
Yeah. One of the things was there was they had spent a lot of money shooting in like Northern Ireland and Morocco, and Daenerys's wedding in Morocco all takes place at night in the original pilot, and they're like, why did we spend all this money to go to Morocco when you can't see anything? So they were like all upset. So they felt like this is supposed to be this epic show, and the scope wasn't coming across, and so that was another thing that HBO was pretty displeased with.
So how did they convince them to let them do it again?
It's interesting because it's a combination of things. One, the fact that they spent $10 million on the first one in some ways helped, because there's this whole sunk cost thing that goes on where it's like, well, we've already invested this much. Do we really want to just write all that off, or do we want to try again? And what the showrunners did that was successful is they didn't blame anybody else. They owned all the mistakes, and they made a list of everything that they thought was wrong with it and exactly how they would fix it. So they didn't go in there going, well, you're wrong, or people don't understand it, or whatnot. They're like, no, you're right. This is not where we need to be. It needs to be several levels up to this, and here is our exact plan for doing that.
Wow, that's a good lesson for creative people and our president. We won't get own your mistakes. There's so many interesting things that you reveal. What were some of the things you were surprised to learn in writing this? Because here you're a guy who probably knows more about this show than anyone, including people who were even on the show, because you covered it so extensively for so many years of your life. But were there certain things in writing this book you were like, wow, I'm actually... And the other tricky thing I would imagine for you is that so much is being written about the show by so many different media outlets. Now you're competing with social media, all these things. So how you break stories? Tell me some of the things that you actually found out for the first time in this book.
A lot of the early season stuff were things I didn't know, because I covered the show relatively intensely early on. The first time I was on set was season 2, and at the time the show still wasn't this big thing. So I kind of increased the intensity of my coverage as the seasons went on and spent more and more time on set. But those early, some of the early things that you're asking about, from those early meetings and the pitch meeting with HBO and the failed pilot and the first season when nothing went right and there was so much chaos, and staging the first battle in the Battle of the Blackwater, and like all those things had a lot of information that I didn't know. And then there were things along the way. As I say in the introduction, Game of Thrones was a controversial show from literally its first episode to its last. So there's a lot of things that during the show people were reluctant to talk about, but after the show ended, they were willing to be more open about. So I was able to kind of revisit a lot of the things that in some cases had only been discussed off the record, but I never got them to go on the record about. So I was excited to do that.
What were some of those things?
And then there were just sort of like random things, like the Diana Rigg stories, some of which have been online about how feisty and combative that she could be.
I did unspeakable things to protect my family, or watch them being done on my orders. I never lost a night's sleep over them. They were necessary. And whatever I imagined necessary for the safety of House Tyrell, I did.
Which is sort of delightful, because I think people always kind of like it when actors are in some ways like the characters they play, and she was kind of like the character she played, and I think that's pretty endearing.
Can you give an example of Diana Rigg being a little bit feisty on the set?
Well, there's one I love that Jessica Henwick, who played one of the Sand Snakes, talked about, because they had a scene with her, and she comes in and she sits down. It's just a short scene, but she comes in and sits down, and she just goes, "Roll the cameras." And they were like, "Okay, well, we're actually not ready to roll the cameras yet." And she's like, "I'm ready." And so they're like, "Okay, so let's just start shooting." And so they start shooting, and then she gives a couple takes, and of course she does her lines fantastically, because she's Diana Rigg. And then she's like, "I'm done." And if you know how TV shows are made, especially a show like Game of Thrones, one scene can take days to shoot, because they shoot it from so many angles, and they shoot, and they'll turn the camera around to focus on the different actors, while the other actor who's off camera is still there and reacting. And, so these things take a long time. And she just announced, "I'm done." And she just kind of got up and as Jessica put it, she stormed off set, but it was at 0.1 miles per hour, because she's like in her 70s, she can't move very quickly. So it was like the world's slowest version of storming off the set.
Of a mic drop. Right, it's like a slow motion.
Yes, exactly.
There were some other things in there that made raise my eyebrows. And I guess they'd been reported, but you kind of get more into detail. So, for example, the first time that Nikolai Coster-Waldau, who plays Jaime Lannister, meets Gwendolyn Christie, who plays Brienne, and of course they're connected so much in the show. But the first time that Brienne meets Jaime was like kind of really awkward, right?
Yeah, I actually love that chapter, because both of them are really funny and candid. And we're talking about how when people are like their characters, I mean, ultimately, Nikolai and Gwen are not like their characters, but their relationship has an aspect to it off camera which is similar to the characters, and that is there's a certain kind of teasing, combative, but with underlying respect kind of a relationship that they have that is very similar to how they are off camera. And it's almost, and when you're around it, you're a little bit alarmed, because it can be so vicious, and you're like, oh my God, but then you kind of realize what they're doing. And that started from the very first day in terms of the way Nikolai initially treated Gwen, and at first it knocked her off her heels, but Gwen doesn't get knocked off guard very quickly, and she quickly rebounded and started giving shit back to him, and it sort of set the tone for their relationship.
Like, she was kind of a bit intimidated. She had been Gwendolyn, the actress, had actually been watching the show, because she was brought in in later seasons, and she was a little bit intimidated, I think, getting on there. And then he was just like, she went to his trailer to say hello, and he was just like, "Oh, hey, how are you doing?"
He was like, that's you, is it?
Yeah,
when she
just like really
herself.
dismissive of her.
Yeah.
Do you get the impression that he was doing that to sort of almost like he was in character a little bit?
I think that he enjoys teasing people a bit, and I don't know. I don't want to read too much into his motivations, but it's a really funny exchange back and forth in the book as each actor gives their side of how that went down,
right?
And of course evolved into this hugely respectful relationship, which was both on camera and off.
The other thing that's getting some press that you revealed is this Bruce Willis's yacht situation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, this is a little frustrating because I tried hard to try and figure out whether this was true, going back into like photographs from wire photographs to see if I could pin down Bruce Willis's location when this was filmed. But this is basically in season 4 when they were filming in Croatia, in Dubrovnik. They're filming the Mountain versus the Viper epic fight in a seaside amphitheater, and they had to clear all these yachts that were parked right offshore, anchored right offshore there. And there was one yacht that refused to move, and there was one person who owned a yacht who absolutely refused to move, and then started piloting his yacht back and forth as if to disrupt their shot, and they called it yacht rage. And what I heard on set at the time, everybody was saying that it was Bruce Willis.
Yippee-ki-yay, 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 mother.
I mean, everyone was very convinced that that's who it was. Since then, some have walked it back a little bit and like, I'm not sure if anyone actually saw Bruce Willis. I messaged Bruce Willis's rep to try and find out, and I got no reply. So I kind of like it that it's something that's this unknowable mystery of whether it was truly Bruce Willis that tried to disrupt the Game of Thrones set or not. But it's definitely one of those things that's gone down in sort of Game of Thrones crew lore that's what happened.
Some other funny things or interesting things. Hodor has a nude scene early on, and he has to wear a prosthetic because he's apparently a huge man and has to be huge everywhere. And so that was I don't remember reading about that. If I had, maybe I just blocked it out. But how did that actor feel about that experience?
He was told that don't worry, there won't be many people on the set, blah blah blah. And by the way, he requested a prosthetic because there would be kids shooting on set at the same time, and he's like, well then I definitely want to be wearing a prosthetic if that's the case. And so then of course he said it was like the most crowded set that he had ever been on. I mean, one of the things that's kind of a bit recurring during my coverage of the first season is that there were a few times where shooting nude scenes where people were uncomfortable. And I think a lot of it stemmed from the fact that during that first season in general, that they were kind of figuring out how to do things, and that extended to nude scenes as well. And then they kind of course corrected and figured out how to do that better and make actors feel more comfortable later on.
So one of the most famous scenes in all of Game of Thrones lore is the Red Wedding.
Your Grace, I feel I've been remiss in my duties. I've given you meats and wine and music, but I haven't shown you the hospitality you deserve. My king has married, and I owe my new queen a wedding gift.
I mean, it's always a little bit emotional when an actor, when their character gets killed off on a show. But in this case, the filming of Game of Thrones is extremely immersive and intense. And the filming of that sequence took place over a week, and it was done in chronological order. And so basically, the actors went through this extremely painful kind of emotional experience portraying these deaths, and then they were just gone because it was okay, filming's wrapped, and then they go. And especially in Michelle Fairley's case, who played Caitlin Stark so incredibly well in that sequence. She was pretty, from her own admission, she was pretty messed up afterward. And so one of the things that the productions decided to do after that is like, okay, from now on, or at least for a while, if we kill somebody off horribly, let's arrange the schedule so they still have a couple more scenes that they have to do after that. So it isn't, dying a horrible death and then being like booted from the set and having to go home right after that. So like when they killed off Jack Gleason, who plays Joffrey Baratheon in season 4, they made sure he still had more stuff to do so that his death on screen didn't coincide with his end of work.
Right. Did you? So you weren't just writing about this from your home in Austin, Texas. You got to go to the set a few times, right? Did you go to Belfast and different places?
Yeah, I was on the set every season since starting with season 2 through the end, and I visited season 8 twice. I would often spend time on the set in Belfast and in Spain and in Dubrovnik when they were
not a bad
shooting
gig
there too. No, it's funny because it was a fantastic gig, but me being me, I spent almost the entire time completely stressed out trying to get the material that I wanted to get, because I wanted to pay off, EW investing in the set visit by getting enough material for, a ton of stories to roll out during the season. So I was constantly focused on, okay, I need to get this actor, I need to get this question answered, I need to get color from this scene. So I was always focused on my goals. And so, I look back on them like, man, I wish I would have stopped to just kind of like enjoy it all more.
You're working. It's like when people say, yeah, when you're on a work trip, I mean, it probably was not fun. And I know the feeling of like, what about my recorder's not working? And, I got to get this actor and he seems to be in a bad mood. And, whatever it is, that you're dealing with. Was it very controlled, the set? Like, especially as the seasons moved on and they were very sensitive about secrets being revealed and things like that, was it almost like going to like a communist country where, you going to North Korea or something where you have to like show them your tape recorder or whatever? Like, I mean, how did they manage like that kind of stuff? Or did they just trust you?
Yeah, definitely by like the final couple seasons, I mean, they would like take your phone and put stickers over the camera. Wow. And you had passes to and badges that had to be scanned, and like this one-way gate to get on the set. And they had the people like watching out for drones and had the airspace cleared by the government. There's one set in Spain where they literally had the army like setting up a blockade miles away. The security on the set was crazy, and yet still people were managed to infiltrate and get paparazzi managed to infiltrate some sets and get shots of sensitive scenes. So yeah, there was always this sort of spy versus spy aspect between the production and people trying to get spoilers, and constantly evolving their techniques to try and keep up with the level of infiltration tactics that kept being rolled out.
But it didn't seem like that was of interest to you. Like you just wanted to, not that you wanted to play by the rules necessarily, but you didn't want to like spoil anything or piss people off, or I don't know. Or am I wrong about that?
Well, I was completely down for writing about controversies. I wrote about every one of the major show controversies, and I also recapped the show for EW, where I basically made fun of every single episode. And every time I'd file one of those stories, I'm like, well, this is the last time I'm being invited back. Yeah. But the key, I think, in terms of being allowed to keep coming back is writing for EW, because we would do like a cover story and send me the set every season. But B, it was another thing you said, and that was spoilers, because from the very early on, that first season, that set visit, I found out things on the set of season 2 that they really didn't want out there, and I didn't report those things because as a viewer myself, I don't like to know spoilers. I don't want to be have my viewing experience ruined. Some people like spoilers. So some people say, doesn't matter how much I know, it doesn't change things for me. I'm the opposite. I love to be surprised. So in my entertainment reporting, I always focus more on the creative process. And then after something airs, then I'll, get into all the spoilery stuff afterwards. And that mindset aligned with what the producers wanted. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was one reason that I got the access that I did, because so many people wanted Game of Thrones spoilers. That was such a cottage industry of media coverage, where I was like, I don't want to spoil it for anybody. I just really want to document, the drama of making this and how it happens.
You did a great job on that. And how did you get the actors later now? You must have won the trust of everybody, because you got the actors really to open up to you. And as a reporter, what advice do you give to people about getting people to really be honest with you and open up to you? Because a lot of times celebrities are very, very guarded. And so tell me what and everybody's guarded. I shouldn't just say celebrities.
Yeah.
But.
Well, first, in terms of getting interviews, that was tough, because after the show ended, people felt like they were done. Mm-hmm. They were like, this was the most exhausting work I have ever done shooting this final season. Everyone felt broken at the end of it. And then they had to do publicity for it, which is exhausting in itself. And nobody wanted to talk about it, after that. So trying to get everybody, and that was one of the huge hurdles for this book, because there's so many must gets. I wanted to get, the showrunners and George and the core cast and as much of the supporting cast as I could. And there were so many actors where I was like, well, if I don't get this person, I'm not doing the book. And there'd be lots of back and forth with a publicist, and then they would agree. And I'd be like, oh, thank God. So there's a lot of, working on this book where I didn't know if the book was going to happen, and I was just continuing to plow forward in hopes that it all came together. And fortunately, it did. In terms of getting people to open up, one thing, I'm very self-critical and about the things I do not well. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I think that I do well is that I tend to be good about trying to see things from other people's point of view. I don't take cheap shots in my coverage. I don't assume. I can be critical, but I don't assume somebody's intentions. And I think that's something that you see a lot on social media nowadays, especially in the aftermath of Game of Thrones and people's reaction to things. It's not enough to just disagree with something or say, I think that was the bad choice. It's, I think that was the bad choice, and you made it because of this reason and because you're a horrible person. It's like, well, no, you don't know that. You're just assuming that because you're mad, right? So whenever I interview somebody, I try to imagine and empathize with what position they were in and what they were thinking. And I try and frame my questions that way, and also ask my questions in a way that they can actually answer. Because, there's sometimes when you go into an interview where it's like, okay, this is spoilery or this is sensitive. So, they're not going to answer it if I ask it this way. But if I frame it from this direction, then they can talk about it. And so it's trying to figure out what's the question that gets to what I need in terms of getting something sensitive and candid, but framed in a way that isn't going to make the walls pop up and then have them completely shut down.
All right, let's talk about that finale. Probably talked about that a lot.
Really? You're going to ask about the series finale?
I know.
I'm so shocked. Nobody
breaking
has asked
news.
about that
Breaking news.
Tour.
I was almost actually not going to ask about it, because I'm like, well, it's going to be written about so much or talked about so much anyway. But I am curious about your perspective on it. I mean, just as a fan of the show, and you, like you said, you wrote critiques for Entertainment Weekly, and I probably should have read your final recap of the finale. But what was your takeaway from the finale? Were you a fan of the finale, or do you have sort of mixed feelings about it? Very controversial.
Here's the thing. As a viewer, one thing I say that frustrates people is that the average fan has a more accurate take on what it was critically like than I do, because I was on set and I knew all the spoilers and I knew how it was put together. And then I'm watching this episode while frantically taking notes to write a recap. That's no way to experience a show. So my viewing experience is completely messed up. And obviously there are a million opinions about the final season. The thing to me is whether you love the final season or whether you hated the final season, what's undeniable is the making of the final season is fascinating. And that's why I spend 6 chapters in the book, touching on various aspects of making the final season. So it's like learning why certain fateful decisions were made as they were made, seeing what the cast and crew went through to pull off the final season was easily the most grueling and ambitious season of television ever mounted. And then seeing their reactions to getting it the reaction that it did. The book is about the drama of what happened. And instead of sort of imposing my opinion on things, which some would disagree with and some wouldn't, and just be one of the many opinions that are already out there, I'm sort of leading the reader through the journey of what happened, and they can make their own mind about whether the reaction was fair or unfair, or whether if they were in that situation, whether they would have made the same decision or a different one.
Do you think the negative reaction, hurt Dan and David? Like, do they take it personally? Do you think they even care?
Oh, they 100% care.
Yeah.
They 100% wanted the final season to be loved. I mean, they spent years thinking about it. One thing that I think is that, in my opinion, is sort of unfair is this sort of is basically the bad faith assumption. It's like one thing to disagree with the decisions somebody made. It's another thing to sort of go, well, they clearly made those decisions because they were tired of the show and didn't care anymore and wanted to do something else. And, and there's just no evidence of that. I mean, and when I say no evidence of that, I mean, every person that worked with them doesn't think that. Because if you met them on the set and you saw them work, you would see that they were obsessed and giving the show 24/7, year after year after year, trying to figure out every single thing they could do to make it better. So it's like, you can say, well, they made the wrong decisions and they should have ended it differently. But I don't think it's accurate to say that they deliberately, tried to tank it or thought that they were doing a disservice to the show intentionally.
Right. And you did get Dan to admit that he might have done things a little differently, like in retrospect, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's being taken out of context a little bit on some stories I saw where they say that, they would have done the finale differently. It's like, well, what he said is that in general, speaking about the show, of course, that they would have done things differently. From they're self-critical to a degree that I think would probably surprise people, and they have probably criticisms of the show that are things that nobody has ever picked up on and nobody would ever think of.
Yeah.
I think I think people get frustrated that they don't agree publicly with certain criticisms, but and this is in the book, but I'm extrapolating it from it a little bit. There's like 3 reasons that I think that they tend not to do that. One of the reasons is that you can't criticize something that thousands of people worked on without indirectly criticizing other people that they worked with, and they would never do that. Second, even if they're just criticizing specifically something they were responsible for, like a line of dialogue or something, even that hurts HBO, which was their partner, and gave them everything they wanted, and made their career dreams come true, and gave them the money they needed, and let them end the show. And they would never want to do something that hurt HBO's product. And the third thing is they often bring up the ending of The Sopranos. Huge controversy. Most people hated it when it aired, and then people had this shifting opinion over the years as they went back and rewatched it. Outside the hype and disappointment of the show ending. So there's always a chance that certain things that people look at negatively now won't be looked at negatively later. So there's really no percentage in agreeing with a criticism and validating it and locking it in when who knows 5-10 years from now, people might feel differently.
All right. Wrapping this up, a prequel, or what do you know? What can you tell me? Is this the last we're going to see of Game of Thrones? Obviously that story has been told, but there's so many other stories that need to be told. What are you hearing? Is a prequel, a postquel, or whatever you call it, a sequel? What do you know?
I mean, there is a prequel that's basically greenlit called House of the Dragon, and it takes place 300 years before the events in Game of Thrones, when House Targaryen reigned in Westeros, and it leads into the famous Targaryen Civil War, also known as the Dance of Dragons. And so that's underway. And what's particularly exciting about that actually is, first, George R. R. Martin's very into it. He's very excited about it. He's closely involved. Also, one of the showrunners is Miguel Sapochnik, who famously directed the Battle of the Bastards and the Winds of Winter episode, and many other great episodes of Game of Thrones. And he is a visionary director and a total workaholic beast. And I'm very curious to see what the show will look like with him in one of the driver's seats.
Who's your favorite character on Game of Thrones?
It tends to change. I mean, for a long time, it was Tyrion, because he's the kind of the most, writer favorite character, right? He's the guy who reads books, who's kind of the outsider, who thinks of himself as the smartest guy in the room, even though he's not. So I feel like writers can often kind of identify with that character. Towards the end of the show, I really was liking what they were doing with Jaime Lannister and what they were doing with the Hound. It tends to change over the time.
All right. Yeah. I can't let you go without asking a TV writer what you're watching right now and what you recommend, because there's so much to watch on all the different streaming services, and it's almost overwhelming. Is there something what are you binging on currently?
Let's see. Well, I've been watching Fargo season 4,
right, with Chris
which
Rock.
is not my favorite season of Fargo, but Fargo is it's like what people say about Sex and Pizza. It's like even when it's not as good, it's still good. Like great. It's still better than most things out there. It's not on right now, but I mean, whenever anybody asks me, I always have to rave about Black Mirror, because I think it's one of the best TV shows of the 21st century. I'm also checking out Raised by Wolves, which I'm kind of midway through on HBO Max, the Ridley Scott series, and starts amazing, then not so much. I'm still waiting to get to how the season ends. But we're in this peak TV era, and although we're going to be in a little bit of a fallow period because of the pandemic, of course, and I'm really excited to see what happens with season 2 of The Mandalorian. When people talk about, well, is there ever going to be another appointment TV show again? I think as long as there are big networks and big companies rolling out shows week by week, that there's a chance of that happening. And I do think, while Mandalorian season 2 might not be as big as Game of Thrones, I do think that's going to be a really big deal this fall, and people are really going to be following that closely.
I'm going to definitely check that out. James, thank you so much for your time. This has been really fascinating. Thanks for writing the book. Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon, and I recommend everybody run out and buy it or download it or do whatever you have to do these days. All right.
Except steal it. Don't do that.
Don't
please.
Steal it, please. In the world of Game of Thrones, there's a lot of stealing.
Price,
there's a lot of stealing going on. All right. I appreciate your time. Hey, thanks so much for listening to Right About Now. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the program on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you might listen to your podcast. And if you can, please rate the podcast and give me a review. It really goes a long way in helping me get the word out there about the podcast. Until we meet again, this is John Small telling you to do the right thing.